Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to a CIO's Guide to Salesforce Data Security webinar with Flosum. We're excited to have everyone join. I am here, Veroljub Mihajlovic. I'm a Senior Director of Product Marketing. So just wanted to quickly review with everyone what we're going to be doing today. We have a panel discussion around the Salesforce data security, and we will be having a recording sent to everyone. There'll be some interactive polls. And if at any point in time you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to put a question into the Q&A section of the webinar. So I am pleased to be introducing today. We have Christian Lind from Nebraska Cancer Specialists joining us today. And we are going to be discussing, so his background is he comes from the CIO's office and gives us a perspective from his side. And then we have with us as well Keith West, who is a technical product director here at Flosum, specifically around our data backup and recovery solution. So we are here. We're going to get started. So be on the lookout for some polls. We're going to make sure that this section or the session is interactive, and we're going to get started. So a lot of folks on the call may have been introduced. Flosum has done a state of Salesforce data backup and recovery report, which is first of its kind. It will be providing key insights for decision makers and technical, both users and technical evaluators. And it'll be an intimate look into the world of Salesforce data backup and recovery. In terms of this report, around half of the folks were users, 31% of them were technical evaluators, and 15% were decision makers, thinking VP of enterprise apps and above. So based off of this, I'd like to kick everything off. And our first question would be for Christian. From your perspective, what are some key data security challenges the modern CIO faces, specifically around enterprise applications? And how has this landscape evolved in recent years?
Sure. So I can kind of speak on all three of those parts because I'm a user. I technically evaluate and I also make the decision as well from my background. But I think part of the big problems that we run into when it comes to these backup and recovery solutions is there's a disconnect between what the users believe a backup solution will accomplish, and then there's what the technical evaluators or the decision makers usually who are seeing the technical specs and SLAs and all the things that go along in the background. There's a disconnect between what they think is actually accomplished by these tools.
Oh, and then that sounds perfect. And then Keith, from your perspective, how have you seen the evolution of the ecosystem evolve?
Yeah, especially around the area of Salesforce backups. I think there's a huge misunderstanding in the IT world about who's responsible for the backups. I think there's a huge misunderstanding for what the backups actually accomplish, and in the trends I've seen lately in this industry in the last couple of years is the backup process has actually become a lot more manual, and there's been a lot more reliance on human processes and manual processes that are easy to have a failure point.
And this brings us at a really great point in time with Salesforce driving a lot of activity during the last Dreamforce around data backup and recovery. We have this state of report where we're going to be reviewing with you key trends such as market adoption, talking about the concept of shelfware, who potentially is involved in the evaluation, understanding shared security, and rating existing solutions. And all of this will be brand new perspectives that have never been shared before with the market. So the first thing I'd like to do is we'll launch a poll for everyone. So right now, the question is do you have currently a data backup and recovery solution? Based off of our polling and what we've seen to date, our results were that we got 67% of folks were saying, yes, we have an existing Salesforce backup solution. But when we dug into that information and we took out the users versus the technical evaluators and decision makers, we see a little bit of a divide where users overwhelmingly, so 4 and 5 folks are saying that they have a solution in place. But when talking to technical evaluators and decision makers, this changes to almost half. There's a little bit of a divide here. And this is really interesting from the perspective, especially since people are really interested in this space. Christian, from an executive standpoint, how often do you see this, or have you seen this before? And how would you explain what we're seeing here?
We see it all the time, I suppose. So the users have a different perspective because they're usually on the receiving end of a recovery from a backup solution. And the technical evaluators are usually coming from the other side where they're seeing the actual mechanics of the actual solution. And so I think there's a disconnect between what they perceive as a full backup solution, what can actually be recovered from a particular product. Users don't really see the full scope, and a lot of times the full scope of a backup is hardly ever implemented. Users, like in an infrastructure environment or a file system environment, you may get a single file restore or a database restore, something like that, but you've never seen like a server restore or an environment restore or an Active Directory restore or something of that nature. So there's a disconnect between what they believe is, yes, we have a full backup solution, and what the technical evaluators see as something that provides a holistic kind of, it's going to cover everything in our environment and be able to recover from it.
Gotcha. And we're getting our results back, so I'm going to share our results, which match up. So around 64% of folks that are online are saying that they have a backup solution. And then Keith can relate to a lot of people who are on our call today as a seasoned, experienced veteran with boots on the ground experience. How would you explain the fact that the users are perhaps thinking that they have a backup solution, they are protected?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, for a lot of years, the Salesforce environment had a backup process that ran. You could schedule it; it was automated. The assumption was that it was actually backing up data, but they may have never had to restore. I see a lot of people who, yeah, we got a backup process, but what is that? Is it one of the more manual processes like data exports or data loader or report export out of Salesforce? And what do you really get with that? Do you get all the files? So I don't think they have any perspective at the user level or the admin level exactly what is backed up. They may be aware of some process being there, but they've never, as Christian has suggested, they've never actually had to restore from this or never had to bring that data back, and just don't understand if they really can or not. Maybe they've never had an incident where they've had to restore data. So. And also just no understanding of how manual the steps would be or how long it would take to restore that data.
Yeah, the business perspective and the impacts associated versus what you're siloed and you're responsible for.
Right. Yeah.
So the next question that we have here is to Keith's point is we really want to ask this next question is thinking about it and understanding the solution, have you tested your data backup and your data backup and recovery solution in the last 6 months? Because this is where things start to feel the pedal to the metal. And then we found that 56% of folks have said yes to this question. With the level of confidence, Christian, that you have with the last question where users were saying yes, that we have a backup solution. Can you explain the concept maybe of shelfware and what are the risks of not testing a solution like this from your perspective or a CIO's perspective?
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of these products that we work with for backup solutions, once you install them, they come with their own analytics. They come with their own kind of self-diagnostics and reporting and everything. And as long as you're getting all the green lights, you assume that product is working correctly, and that may not always be the case. And then you, in this particular one, define a test. Is a test a file recovery, a database recovery, a report recovery, or what exactly is that? Because there's many different ways of recovering different objects within environments. and you may not be testing those all, and you may be using actual recoveries, like somebody lost something and then they recovered it, and say, okay, I've done a test. I was like, there are smaller SMBs. The enterprises probably don't do this nearly as much because they have a much bigger team to test these systems out and everything like that. But sometimes these things go by the wayside, and this is your test. Yes, I was able to recover a file or a database or something along those lines, and that's your test. And it works, and you assume that it works, and then you rely on your reporting and analytics to say, yes, my environment is backing up, but you're not doing an actual full backup.
No, and then that makes sense. And then from our market research, having these conversations with potential prospects and clients, a large portion of the time, people are very confident in their backup capabilities. But then when it comes to testing, certain anomalies start happening. And the key thing here is just making sure that you're covered in those edge cases, because according to Keith, and I'll share this right now, the folks that have been that are part of this webinar, a lot of them are saying that they haven't perhaps tested as maybe as thoroughly as they should have. But Keith, can you just mention, when you're doing this recovery or disaster recovery exercise, what are the key things and the mindsets that you should be having when you're evaluating your current solution?
There are some key things you need to be looking at. First of all, I think people think about backups as just data, but when you have a SaaS system, you also have to worry about your configuration. Maybe you've had a system like Salesforce for a decade, and can you imagine what it would take to recover every single configuration you've ever done in that system so you can be back up and running? So people often leave metadata or the configuration piece out of their thoughts about backing up, or they just don't even think they need to back up because it's a SaaS solution and it doesn't sit on their system, and so they're not responsible for backups. And then I'd say with the data backups, you need to make sure, can you recreate the process to restore the data? It's one thing to back it up. If you're using a traditional, full backup and incremental backup system, you have to lay the full backup back down, lay the incrementals on top of it. If you're using some of the more manual processes like saving off the CSVs or data loaders, you have to know how to load records back in Salesforce back in the right order. There's a parent-child relationship, and you have to load the children first, and you have to get all those right before you can load the next thing. So there's just a lot of really manual processes that you can have when you're restoring data that can greatly affect whether that data is actually able to be restored or not, and have the proper relationships once it gets back into the database.
And that makes sense. And this leads us into the next conversation point we'd like to have with everyone is, in the grand scheme of things, who is involved in this evaluation process for a Salesforce backup? And typically what we found was the VP of the platform and his team, including the architect and the InfoSec team, are primarily responsible for the evaluation of the Salesforce backup and restore solution. And typically, they are the ones that are in charge of understanding the RTO, RPO around the business. So the recovery point in time, how quickly, what are the kind of the business objectives of a recovery solution? From your perspective, Christian, is this typically what you see as the evaluation process for your enterprise applications that the CIO is managing?
Yeah, that's usually the process. The person who's going to be directly dealing with the solution is usually the one that's making the decision making. They may be influenced by the users a little bit, and then they have to answer to a finance department or to another or compliance and risk or a C-level, to get sign off. And there's usually, when they do that, there's an explanation of what it is, that what the solution is going to do, but it may or may not be clear to both parties, users and the person ultimately signing off, exactly what the solution is and what it's capable of doing. A lot of that, honestly, looking at your list on your poll, every single person on that list should be involved with that decision. It should be your technical people. You should have users in there making that decision, because when you tell them, a recovery of this kind of inside of our environment will take X amount of hours, they're going to give you feedback on well, that's unacceptable. I can't be down for that long or have it take that long for that particular recovery. And they need to be aware of that so they can adapt to their processes. And it also, management has to give realistic expectations on those recoveries and how they go about.
And this makes a lot of sense. And what we're seeing is it aligns exactly to what you were saying. And then from Keith, from your perspective, is now that we've established the team and we have good context of who the usual suspects are, what's the mindset this team should have going into the evaluation mode?
Yeah, I think that this is a great place to begin with the end in mind. What do you need, right? I think a lot of people go into evaluation. They just go start checking out websites of companies they know that do backups and restores and archives. And they don't really start with a list of what do I need. They just see, oh, there's a cool feature on this one. Do you have this cool feature as part of their evaluation process? When reality is, the proof is in the pudding. What do I really need for a backup? What do I really need for an archive? What do I really need for a restore? And what timeline, my recovery time objective, how fast do I have to restore, and my recovery point, how much data am I willing to risk losing? So I think you have to come into the conversation thinking about what risks you're trying to alleviate and how you're going to get there from in the end, from the very beginning, right? And what does the backup tool do that, regardless of what the other cool features you might be thinking about, or what you think about a backup? Do you need to restore metadata? Do you need to restore data? How much data can you lose? How fast do you have to recover it? How much, for example, if your recovery time objective for cases is 15 minutes, well, you're going to have to pick a system that can do that, right? So you just have to decide what you want out of a system or need out of a system. And some of that's driven by compliance. You have a compliance reason to have a backup, or you have a business risk reason to have a backup. And you just have to make sure that those are actually being accomplished with the tool you're buying, not just a list of cool features.
Perfect. And then we're going to go into, from that mindset that the team needs to have, and then the key fundamentals around data security. And I think that this is a particular challenge in our ecosystem. As Christian said it, often the view from senior executives is Salesforce is a SaaS app. They have us covered. And then there is a particular aspect here of the understanding the shared responsibility security model around the Salesforce security. Keith, maybe I'll ask you, do you mind maybe giving a quick, succinct summary of what the Salesforce security shared security model is? And then we'll ask Christian in terms of what his perspectives are from an organizational standpoint.
Right. So again, we've hinted at this throughout this webinar, but a lot of people just don't realize that they have any responsibility with the SaaS tool, and especially with Salesforce over the years. Just don't have a feeling that they're responsible for backups, for metadata or data. However, Salesforce has a very clear published policy on shared responsibility. Generally, that policy explains that Salesforce has a responsibility for the hardware, making sure that's secure, making sure the networks are secure and all the systems are secure, with the right level of access and separation of duties and those sorts of things around the environment, and the responsibility for data and metadata, the backup of that data, the restoration of that data, and all your policies around data and who has access to it are the responsibility of the customer. And Salesforce security is a complex, multi-layered process, and it's easy to get wrong. And so it's important that you understand your responsibility, that you do have risks, and those risks might look like a person who's made a mistake. I've talked to a buddy of mine who deleted every single opportunity out of a production Salesforce org because the security wasn't set up properly. Now, fortunately, that didn't overrun the wastebasket in Salesforce, and he's able to restore it pretty quickly. But let's say it's a much bigger system and a lot more records, and it blows out your wastebasket, and you have no way to recover that data. Just human error. There are bad actors who have access and get into systems, and that is a risk. one of the major risks for Salesforce organizations is during the migration process when they're moving new metadata or new configurations and new data layouts into their Salesforce environment for a business unit or whatever. They've spent a couple of years building this. Things don't always go like they're supposed to in a migration weekend. Sometimes you need to back out what you did, and just flat getting back to where you were Friday before you started the migration can be a days, weeks, and months long operation when it comes to data, because you have no way to identify what changed because of the migration. So there are some real risks out there. And it's not as scary as maybe ransomware, but it certainly does bring a lot of risk. And you're talking about having your systems down, the systems that you're making money on. What if you lose all the opportunities for a quarter? What if your communities are not up and running and earning you money? That's a whole stream of revenue gone. So I don't think people understand the risks there are out there for a SaaS system like Salesforce.
And we're going to share our results right now, and we're almost bang on with everybody that's in the webinar matching up with what we're seeing from our market research survey. So Christian, from an executive standpoint, why do you think there is often the case of it's the SaaS provider's responsibility, and then from a person that's in IT, how does that begin to unravel that whole dichotomy there?
Yeah, that's pretty common in all sectors of IT. It's a belief that there is a very common belief that when you push something that is an on-prem or a inside of your environment to a cloud environment, that you are somehow giving away responsibility. And in some ways, don't get me wrong, you are. You're no longer responsible for the uptime and the infrastructure involved, the maintenance involved within the application, stuff like that. So you're trading off some of those, but a lot of times that doesn't absolve you of the responsibility for who gets access to the application. What Keith was talking about is a real problem. I mean, we know even from file systems that usually the problem is somebody deleted something. That's fairly common, and they're allowed to do that. But that doesn't mean that you can't be able to recover that. You can't just rely on your users to know that they should or should not do something. And then there's just got to be a realistic expectation of what exactly was in that contract that you signed. What is your responsibility? And you need to understand and make sure that you're covering your bases on that.
All right, perfect. And then the final question before we go into the audience questions here. I really like this one. We'll start the poll for this one. Is how would you rate your current data backup solution? And just based off of the results here, I think everyone here would be interesting in terms of the results. What we found is that the users of these solutions, 63% of them said it was very good and excellent experience. And then the technical evaluators and decision makers went completely the opposite, where almost exactly the same percentage said that their experience has been average and lower. And this is just really interesting in terms of a people dynamic and then the solution dynamic and understanding a little bit wider context. Christian, how often do you find this divisiveness in the IT ecosystem here?
Every day. It's because the users receive the end product. They see the recovery, and that's generally where that stops at. They put in they contact their support. They put in a request, say I have this thing that needs to be recovered, and then magically on the other end of that, 15 minutes later, maybe it spits back out. On the other hand, you don't actually know what the technical evaluators or the people that are dealing with the recovery are actually seeing. So they may be looking in the environment and going, oh, well, maybe the backups didn't work, and maybe the recovery that I gave to this individual was actually not yesterday's backup, but the day before's backup, because that was the only good backup. It's still fine for the user because that's what they needed. But you're on your end looking at it and saying, no, I should be able to recover from yesterday, or this recovery should have taken 5 minutes and not 15 minutes. or I had to do a workaround in order to get that correctly resolved for the user on the other end, and they see the actual internals of the recovery, and that's why they say it's average at best, and the user just sees the end product. They take their car to the garage, and the mechanic's the one that works on it, and he knows what all the work that went into it, but the user doesn't see that. They just see their car come out the other end there, and it's good and working, and they're happy with the results of it, so they're satisfied with that.
And I'm going to share our results. And then again, very much mirrors what we're seeing here, where almost half half are between very good, and then the others are below average and average. And then Keith, maybe you want to talk to the particulars of the Salesforce environment and the fact that there's Salesforce products and there's automated solutions, and where these types of results might be coming from.
Yeah, right. So Salesforce itself as a platform has, in the past, has had an automated backup system for many years. I remember using that system when I was a Salesforce admin. Was very frustrated with how it worked and how I never really knew what was going on with backups, and sometimes went for months at a time without a proper backup. Salesforce actually dropped that product a couple of years ago, and they have given some best practices for backups that are very manual processes, like data export service. They do the data export, and you have to know when to go get that data export, and you have 2 days to get it, or they delete it. Data loader and report exports, and they just don't back up all of the data. If you can get it with a bulk API, you can get it, but they don't do big objects. They don't do some of the other binaries. They don't do anything that doesn't have a create date on it. So there's just a lot missing there. Also, Salesforce doesn't do metadata backups. They have a very manual process for metadata, and they actually suggest to you that you use change sets to keep track of your metadata, which is, I don't know if anybody on here has ever done a change set. It's a very manual process and not very reliable. Again, it all comes down to reloading stuff back in the right order. So you have to ask yourself, what are your risks? What are your compliance requirements? What is the time that you need, and what data do you need to recover quickly? And do you think you can do that consistently with the very manual processes that are available with Salesforce right now?
Perfect. So what our plan is next is just for everyone that's involved in this webinar, send in any questions that you might have. We'll launch a poll right here if you're interested in learning more about Flosum or state of data backup and recovery. Everyone here will get a link to the report itself, and then also we will be providing you a copy of this reporting. So please share with any of your colleagues that might be interested. So please submit your questions, and then now I will tackle them, and we will just chat with Christian and Keith about the questions that have come in. All right, so our first question is, someone is asking, so how do I convince senior leadership to actually fund these initiatives? Often they're seen as basically with not needed because Salesforce or the enterprise application has us covered. Christian, how do we...
Can I first say in there's another hidden question there too, from my years of experience as a technical architect, is how do I go to my boss and tell him that we have not been backing up something that we should have been backing up, right? And have that conversation. It's going to be an uncomfortable conversation. But I think there's also a great misperception in the IT industry about, what SaaS environments aren't backed up. But I'm going to hand it over to Christian because he and I have talked about this extensively.
Yeah. You hear this one a lot, especially when you're asked. We all know that IT consumes money, and that these products are, you got to get budgetary approval. And how do you clear that? And you need to have that relationship with your boss first. That you need to be able to go to him and say, look, I'm not comfortable with the solution that we got, and I want to make sure that your expectations of what this product does are realistic. And then there's just spell out to him and say, what is your belief on how quickly we can recover or what we can recover, and see what his understanding is, because there may be a disconnect between you and him about what the product actually does, and he may not be aware of that, or she may not be aware of that, and you need to set that realistic expectation. And then you can kind of say, okay, so knowing that what we both know now, do you think this is a acceptable solution, or do you think we need something better? And that's kind of the sideways that you get in there. The alternative, and I'm never going to advocate for this, break something. I was like, it works really quick with senior level people. When something breaks, that's strike when the iron is hot, because when something breaks, everybody at the top is fully aware that when something is not working. And if assuming that you get something recovered and say, hey, we had this problem, and I just want you to know this is what it took to resolve it. Was that comfortable for you? And if it wasn't, well, then we need to look at another solution and take advantage of that. But don't be afraid to do that immediately afterwards, and kind of go to your management and say, here's what happened, here's how we resolved it, here's what we could have done better,
And
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 from there.
dealing with particularly senior folks such as the C levels or the executives, I think what often comes up is incidents and issues that may have happened in a like industry. How would you leverage that as well as a driving force for the change for good?
Is that one for me?
Yes.
um, how do we change this in a different industry?
Or same industry. Somebody that's in a similar industry and then they've had a cybersecurity incident or a data issue that's affected quite widely.
I
And then you are
Yeah,
in the PII space, so there's a lot of examples
I
there
think
that
I
I
think
think
it's
happen.
I don't think there's a whole lot of difference across the board depending upon what industry you're in. Now, granted, healthcare is not going to have the same level of uh, compliance as, say, like manufacturing, but you're still going to have these conversations because at the end of the day, it's still a business. It's you're still you need these applications in order to run the business. So there isn't a this only applies if you're in healthcare or if you're in government or if you're in banking. No, it covers across the board, and you can have the same conversation with your management and discover what is the correct solution for you, and have that conversation. Um, Hopefully that answers that question.
Well, I
Yep.
mean, from your perspective, like, I mean, you are in the hospital or medical industry. Can you look at other examples in your industry and say, wow, we don't want that to happen?
Oh,
Uh,
sure. Oh,
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And we've had that particular instance come up even recently. I won't mention any names or anything like that, but we have known two other hospitals that, in my opinion, should have been way more secure than we were, that were breached, and had to do recoveries, and that is a very, very painful scenario. And maybe when they did the recovery, and it took weeks to recover some of these environments back up to where they originally were functional, even, that exists. And you need to, especially like in healthcare or any other environment, you need to be able to look at your others in your field and say, hey, look what happened over here. That could be us. We need to figure out what it was that they were doing, because especially in mine, like we've had to deal with those recently, and I look at those environments and I'm like, those guys should be working better than me, and yet they were down for that long, and that scares me. And that's when I go to my boss, and I say, or we need to make sure that we're toeing the line here, that we're doing what's best for us, and making sure that we're recoverable as much as possible within compliance within our budget and everything like that, and that we're not leaning too hard on the fact that maybe we're a smaller target. I don't think that's a thing anymore. Everybody's a target at this point if you listen long enough.
And then we have a question here for Keith. Actually, we have two questions, and then I think people are really interested in is like, okay, so we've heard a lot about Salesforce backup options and what comes out of the box. Do you mind quickly explaining what the options are? And then the other question was, what are potentially some of the gaps or things that we need to extend beyond what those options are currently offer us?
Right, right. So we talked about primarily customers right now who are using Salesforce are using one of the manual processes that are available. Like I said, those are uh, uh, the backup processes, very manual backup processes that they
So
have.
The CSV
The CSV
backups.
list, the data export, and other processes like that. Again, those are technically saving off records, and maybe saving off some of your binary data. But you have to understand the relationships of that data and how to put it back properly. Salesforce has recently restored or come back with their backup product. If you go look at the backup product that they provide, it does not do big objects. It does not do anything that's not any record that's not available on the bulk API. So that leaves some things out. It does not do metadata. Metadata still things like change sets. The other disadvantage of doing a backup straight on the SaaS platform is that it's not an offsite backup, right? When you have some third-party tools actually provide an offsite backup, so your data is stored somewhere else than your system. So if you had to recover a different Salesforce system and you had the metadata and the data, you could get a blank Salesforce org back to the configuration that it was and back to the data that it had when you ran into the issue.
And that might potentially invalidate some of the HIPAA, PII, or GDPR requirements about storing data in offsite or not on the principal location to be able to back those up,
right?
Potentially. And then, so you mentioned there is the Salesforce backup and restore product, and then you can use the bulk API for some of the more advanced users. And someone asked about the sandbox as well that you can use.
Right. So there is you can also back up data to a full sandbox or restore from there or get data back from there by using APIs. There's really no easy way to do that. And the problem you have there is that data in a sandbox has completely different IDs. It might be an identical record, but it has a different ID, and you can't link that back up, and you can't relate it back to the way it was on the production system. So just anything besides a fully automated backup and fully automated restore, and even some fully automated backups that use the full and incremental process are fairly arduous to restore because you have to lay down the full backup first and lay down all your incrementals on top of that. So I think that it's just key to look at what the manual processes are for your system. Can I recreate those in fast enough of a time to get my data back to where it needs to be or metadata back to where it needs to be?
Well, and then you were mentioning as well that this process is specifically for the sandboxes is around what 20, 35 days. So it's a very lengthy process to be
Oh
able
yeah,
to back
yeah.
it up.
You can only do backups every so often with that, and right, and it can take weeks to recover from that. Right.
All right. So I think we're coming to the end of our questions. As you can see here at Flosum, we're experts around data backup and recovery. We also have an automated solution that can help you. So if you're interested, please drop us a line. We can have a further conversation, as well as if you're interested in learning more about the state of Salesforce data backup and restoration. I'd like to thank everyone for joining. And then a quick reminder, we will send you emails with all of our content as well as the recording. And please share with your colleagues and anyone who might be interested in learning a little bit more. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Have a good rest of the day.